Miles Corrigan walked into the Axiom Logistics Systems building on a Tuesday morning in November, carrying a briefcase he had owned for 11 years and a coat that had seen better winters. Preston Daly, the company's chief operating officer, took one look at him from across the lobby and made a decision that would cost him everything he had spent 8 years building. And he made it in under 4 seconds. That is where this story begins. But it does not end where Preston expected it to. And the part that actually matters happened before the boardroom, before the client call, before any of it. It happened in a glass-walled meeting room on the 14th floor, in the 11 minutes before anyone with authority arrived. The city was Vancouver. The rain had come in from the coast the night before, and was still at it, indifferent and thorough, the kind of November rain that makes the mountains disappear entirely and leaves you with just the gray water and the gray sky pressing down together. Miles Corrigan had driven in from Burnaby, dropped his son Finn at school, and found parking 2 blocks away because the visitor lot was full. He arrived at 8:47, 13 minutes early, with damp shoulders and a badge the front desk had printed with his name spelled Corrigan. He did not correct it. He sat in the visitor area with his briefcase across his knees the way a man sits when he has learned not to waste energy on impatience. He was 48 years old. He had the kind of stillness that takes a long time to arrive at, not the stillness of a man who has nothing to say, but the stillness of a man who has learned, at some cost, when to say it. 3 years earlier, his wife Joanne had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of lymphoma. She had died 14 months after that. Their son Finn was 9 at the time, and for the year that followed, Miles had done what he considered the only reasonable thing. He left his position as Director of Technical Operations at a mid-sized software firm in Calgary, moved them both to Burnaby to be closer to Joanne's sister, and stayed home. He was Finn's only parent, and Finn was 12 now and doing reasonably well, which Miles considered the only metric that had ever truly mattered. The career gap was 20 months long. He knew how it looked on paper. He had stopped apologizing for it the 3rd time someone read his résumé with that particular expression, the one that mixed sympathy with the quiet arithmetic of dismissal, and he had never started again. Arlen Moss had reached out to him 6 weeks earlier through a recruiting firm Miles did not know, asking whether he would consider coming in for a confidential conversation. Arlen Moss was 69 years old and had founded Axiom Logistics Systems 22 years ago in a converted loft space in Gastown with 2 engineers and a second-hand server rack. He had stepped back from daily operations 4 years earlier and handed the wheel to a management team he had chosen carefully. And, as it was now becoming apparent, incorrectly. The message Arlen had sent through the firm was brief. Axiom was conducting a quiet review of its senior leadership structure. Miles had been identified as someone worth speaking to. The engagement was strictly confidential, and Miles was under clear instruction not to discuss the nature of his visit with any sitting officer of the company before meeting with Arlen directly. Miles had agreed to those terms. He understood them precisely. And they were, as it turned out, the specific terms that would make the next 2 hours so much more difficult than they needed to be. Preston Daly stepped out of the elevator at 8:52, with the particular energy of a man who treated his own schedule as a weather system everyone else had to work around. He was 51, compact and well-dressed, with a firm handshake and the habit of deciding things quickly. He had joined Axiom 8 years ago from a supply chain consulting firm in Toronto, had reorganized the operations division in his first 18 months, and had been rewarded with a title and a corner office on 14 that looked out at the water. He was genuinely good at a very specific kind of management. The kind that produces clean quarterly numbers while consuming the people who generate them. He saw Miles Corrigan sitting in the visitor area, and he performed, without knowing he was performing it, the same rapid assessment he applied to everything. He took in the coat, the briefcase, the badge with the misspelled name, and he reached a conclusion. He walked over and introduced himself in the tone a person uses when they are not especially interested in the introduction but feel it is necessary. He told Miles that he was not aware of a technical contractor being scheduled for that morning, and asked whether Miles had perhaps been sent by one of their infrastructure vendors. Miles stood when Preston spoke to him, which Preston interpreted as the correct response to authority, and therefore confirmed his initial read. Miles told him politely that he had a 9 o'clock appointment and that he had been asked to meet someone on 14. Preston said that 14 was the senior leadership floor and asked who had scheduled the meeting. Miles said he was not in a position to discuss the details before the meeting took place. Preston's expression did not change, but something behind it did. He told Miles that he appreciated the discretion, that he understood how these things worked, and that there had likely been a mix-up with the booking system, which happened more than it should. He said all of this with great reasonableness while gesturing toward the side corridor that led away from the main elevator bank. He suggested they find a quiet room and sort it out. Miles went. He went because Arlen Moss had told him to use the time before the meeting to understand the company from the inside, and because watching how a senior officer handled an ambiguous situation in an empty hallway told you more about that officer than any performance review ever would. The room Preston chose was glass-walled and small, with a round table, 4 chairs, and a whiteboard someone had not fully erased. A junior analyst named Ji-won Yoon was already in the room working through a spreadsheet. She gathered her things to leave when Preston came in. Preston told her to stay. He said it would only be a minute. It was not a minute. Preston sat across from Miles and asked to see his documentation. Miles opened his briefcase and drew out a folder. The folder had a cover sheet with 3 words printed on it in plain type, and those 3 words were not the name of any vendor or contracting agency. They read, Senior Leadership Preston leaned forward slightly before he caught himself. Miles set his hand flat over the cover sheet and waited. Preston recovered well. He said that leadership reviews were conducted by an external firm and that results were delivered directly to the board, and he asked Miles which firm he was representing. Miles said he was not representing a firm. Preston said that independent consultants typically came with a letter of introduction from the board liaison. Miles said his instructions had been specific, and that he was not able to share further detail before the meeting. There was a pause that lasted longer than it should have. Then Preston changed directions the way a man does when the door he tried did not open. He asked Miles to walk him through his background, not as a demand, he said, but as a courtesy, just to help clarify what kind of expertise they were working with. Miles told him he had spent 11 years in technical operations across 3 companies, the last of which he had joined as a senior engineer and left as director. Before that, infrastructure management for a regional logistics network in Alberta. He mentioned the gap of 20 months himself, without waiting to be asked. Preston asked about the gap. Miles said his wife had died and he had stayed home with his son. Preston said nothing for a moment. Then he said he was sorry to hear it. Said it the way people say it when they are already moving past it. He said the kind of focus required for senior technical leadership was considerable, and that a significant career interruption, however understandable, raised real questions about readiness. He said this gently, which was the version of it that did the most damage. Miles said, "What kinds of technical problems has the company been struggling with this past year?" The room went quiet. Ji-won Yoon's fingers stopped moving on her keyboard. Preston said that was not the sort of information shared with people who had not yet established their role in the building. Miles nodded and did not press it. He asked instead whether Axiom's engineering team had seen any notable departures in the past 12 months. Preston's jaw tightened at the hinge. He picked up the folder and drew out the document clipped inside the front cover. The résumé, not the review sheet. And he read it the way someone reads a document they expect to find an error in. He found the gap first, and the company name before it, and the revenue figure, and the employee count, and he set the document back down. He said, "Your last company was a fraction of Axiom's scale." Miles said, "It was. It was also profitable for the first time in 4 years when I left it." The word landed on the table between them. Axiom's most recent 2 quarters had both missed margin targets. The engineering team had been turning over. The largest client in the portfolio had sent 2 formal letters of concern in the past 8 months, and Preston had responded to both through his commercial team rather than in person. Preston closed the résumé and placed it back in the folder and said that the most useful thing would be to connect Miles with someone from the technical talent acquisition team who could match him with an appropriate opening. He said there were likely some solid mid-level roles on the infrastructure side. He said he would be happy to have someone make an introduction. He said it kindly. He said it with the particular kindness that is a form of dismissal dressed in the clothes of helpfulness. Then he picked up the folder, Miles' folder, the one Miles had carried in from the rain, and he slid it with the flat of his hand across the table toward the door. The way you slide something away from you when you are finished with it. Ji-won Yoon watched this from her seat at the end of the table. Miles looked at the folder sitting halfway across the table. Then he looked at Preston. He said, in the tone of a man who is genuinely asking rather than accusing, "Is that also how you responded when your 3 senior engineers submitted their transfer requests last spring? Or did you find them something more appropriate for their experience level as well?" The half-erased whiteboard was the loudest thing in the room for a moment. Preston's face did not move, his eyes did. He asked Miles where he had gotten that number. Miles said he was not able to answer that. It was the truth. The number appeared on page 7 of a confidential brief the board had provided to every candidate in the succession review. 3 senior engineers had left in a 6-month window. 2 departures had been announced as planned transitions. The third had simply stopped appearing in the company directory one Monday morning without explanation. Preston stood up. He was still composed, but the composure had shifted into something colder. He told Miles that this floor was not a place for guesswork, that people who came into senior spaces without clearance and made inferences about personnel matters were not the kind of people this company needed more of, and that he had 1 elevator ride's worth of time to reconsider his approach. Miles did not stand up. He said simply, "Mr. Moss asked me to wait here." The name dropped into the room the way a stone drops into still water. Preston began to say something. He stopped. He began again. And then the door opened. Arlen Moss was 69 years old and walked like a man who had been in a hurry for most of his adult life and had only recently decided that hurrying was mostly unnecessary. He had been in the corridor for the last 4 minutes. He had been watching through the glass wall the entire time. He came in slowly and looked at the folder sitting on the table between them. He looked at Ji-won Yoon, who was looking at her keyboard. Then he looked at Miles Corrigan, sitting still in his chair with his coat still faintly damp at the shoulders. Arlen said, "Preston." Just the name, nothing else for a moment. Preston started explaining immediately. He said an uncredentialed individual had come up to the senior floor without clearance, had declined to identify his purpose, had made references to confidential personnel information, and had been uncooperative when offered assistance. Arlen let him finish, every word of it. Then Arlen said, "He didn't come here without clearance. I gave him clearance." He turned to address the whole room rather than only Preston. "Mr. Corrigan isn't here to ask you for anything. He's here because the board asked him to come." Arlen looked at the folder that had been slid across the table with the flat of a hand, and then at Miles. And then his eyes settled briefly on the half-erased whiteboard with its old agenda items from some forgotten meeting. "He's here," Arlen said, "to help us understand why this company keeps losing the people who know it best." The sentence was not directed at Preston. It did not need to be. If this were a simpler story, that would be the turn. Preston would go pale, and the justice of it would be swift and clean and satisfying in the way that simple justice always is. That is not what happened. Preston Daly had survived 30 years in competitive organizations by being very good at recalibrating under pressure. He did not crumble. He straightened. He said he welcomed the board's engagement, and that he had nothing to conceal and that his record spoke for itself. He said all of this while looking at Arlen rather than at Miles, which told you most of what you needed to know about where he still believed the weight was sitting. Arlen told him that a formal board discussion had been scheduled for 10 o'clock and that he would like Preston to join them. He said it as an invitation, which it was not. Before he left the room, Preston looked at Jiwon Yoon and told her the spreadsheet she was working on needed to be finalized before lunch, and that he expected it in his inbox by noon. Jiwon said, "Of course." She waited until Preston was out of earshot. Then she opened her desk drawer, took out a manila envelope, and placed it on the table in front of Arlen Moss. She said, "I've been tracking the escalation log failures for the past 14 months. No one asked me to. I didn't know who to give it to." The envelope contained 31 pages. The boardroom on 14 had 4 directors, a CFO named Lorraine Beckett, who had joined Axiom 2 years earlier and had been quietly uneasy ever since, Arlen Moss, Preston Daly, and Miles Corrigan, whose shirt was still faintly damp across the shoulders from the walk-in from the rain. The first question came from a director named Hugh Tasker, who asked Miles directly, if the board handed him operational leadership of the company that morning, what would he do first? Preston leaned back, with the ease of a man who has heard this question answered many times, and found the answers predictable. Miles set his briefcase on the floor beside his chair. He said, "I wouldn't do anything." Lorraine Beckett put her pen down. Miles let the silence sit exactly as long as it needed to. Then he said, "I'd spend the first week finding out why the people who built this company have been deciding it isn't worth staying for." Preston's expression changed. He covered it quickly, but Lorraine saw it, and so did Arlen. What followed was not a conventional board presentation. Miles had no slide deck. He had a legal pad with handwritten notes, and a copy of the internal engineering escalation log that Arlen had provided to every candidate in the review package. He had read all 219 pages the previous evening on the SkyTrain home. He said 3 things and he numbered them. First, Axiom did not have a technology problem. It had a communication problem that had been labeled as a technology problem for long enough that the distinction had been forgotten. Every major client complaint in the past 18 months traced back to internal flags that had been raised correctly and ignored at the management level. Second, the company was not short of capable engineers. It was losing them. That was a different disease with a different treatment, and addressing attrition as though it were a recruiting problem, as the current strategy appeared to, was the same as treating a smoke alarm by removing the battery. Third, the data inside the company was accurate. The reporting system had quietly reorganized itself around what management wanted to hear, which meant the information reaching the senior floor was no longer the information that existed 1 floor below it. Preston challenged all 3. He did it with skill, and Miles acknowledged the parts of the challenge that were legitimate, which was the thing that unsettled Preston more than anything else. He had expected defensiveness. He did not know how to argue with a man who agreed with him when he was right. Preston returned to the gap. He said, a director-level candidate with 20 months absent from the industry, during a period of rapid technical change was a liability, whatever his previous record, and that the board needed to be realistic about what they were considering. Miles said, "I left to be with my son. I came back. The question isn't whether I was away, it's what I was paying attention to while I was." He said it without heat. He said it the way you state a fact about the physical world. Arlen had been quiet for a long time. He asked Preston directly why the company had lost 4 senior engineers in the past year. Preston said 3. Lorraine Beckett opened Jiwon's manila envelope. She drew out the top page and placed it on the table. She said the 4th resignation had arrived in the board's secure system at 7:15 that morning. She read the name. It was the lead architect of Axiom's core product platform, a woman named Sorce Lennox, who had been with the company for 6 years and who had written, in her letter, a quiet and thorough account of the same pattern that Jiwon's 31 pages had been tracking from a different angle. No accusations, no anger, just dates and decisions and the specific costs of both. Preston asked to see the letter. Lorraine told him it had been submitted to the board, not to him. The real measure of the morning arrived at 2 o'clock in the form of a call with Meridian Retail Group, Axiom's largest client, and a company that had been quietly preparing to migrate its entire logistics platform to a competitor. Arlen disclosed to the room that the situation was not a case study or a simulation. It was the actual account, the actual decision, the actual call, scheduled for that afternoon. Miles was asked to lead it. He declined. He said that Preston had managed the Meridian relationship and that the client needed to hear from the person whose name was on the account correspondence. He said a recovery plan introduced by a candidate in a board meeting was a plan that would not survive the weekend. He said it as plainly as he had said everything else that morning. He offered instead to write 3 questions that the call needed to answer before anything else. Preston took the call on speaker with the board present. He had his commercial analyst projections open on his laptop. He had a proposed pricing concession that Lorraine had quietly winced at when she saw the margin impact. Meridian sent their VP of Operations and their head of Systems Integration. The VP was civil and precise. She said Meridian had received Axiom's pricing proposal in August and appreciated the gesture, and that price was not the issue and had never been the issue. She said her team had been given 6 confirmed integration windows in the past year, and 4 of them had been missed. 3 written escalations had been submitted and acknowledged. None had been resolved. Her production schedule had absorbed the cost of 2 delays and could not absorb a 3rd. Preston said the missed windows had been an operations issue and that the operations function had recently seen significant personnel transition, which he framed as context. The VP said, "We're aware. We've watched your team change 3 times in 18 months. That's part of why we're having this conversation." Preston said Meridian was reacting strongly to a difficult patch in an otherwise long and productive relationship. There were 2 full seconds of silence on the line. The VP of Operations said, "With respect, that's exactly the kind of response that made us start looking at your competitor." Nobody on the Axiom side of the table made a sound. Arlen turned his head and looked at Miles. Miles asked the board's permission to ask 1 question. Arlen nodded. Miles asked the VP what Meridian needed in order to consider giving Axiom 60 more days before issuing a transfer notice. She answered without hesitation. A dedicated technical contact with actual decision-making authority, not a ticket queue. Weekly integration reports delivered directly to her team lead, unfiltered, and 1 committed delivery window that Axiom hit completely, on time, without revision after the fact. 3 things, none of them were about price. What Meridian agreed to was not a rescue, it was permission to try. They would hold their migration decision for 60 days. With one of their own systems people reviewing Axiom's integration logs on a fixed weekly basis. It was, at current contract value, approximately $28 million a year, and it had been 40 minutes from being lost forever. When the line went dead, Preston turned to the board and said that the entire morning had been engineered against him, that Miles had arrived with the specific purpose of undermining his credibility, and that the board had manufactured a scenario to produce a predetermined outcome. He used the word ambush. He said it twice. Ji-won Yoon had been in the room since 10 o'clock, sitting against the wall with her notepad, not a director, not an officer, brought in to operate the presentation display, and then quietly forgotten about the way capable people in junior positions often are. She was 24 years old. She had a student loan, a month-to-month lease in East Vancouver, and 14 months' worth of documented evidence that nobody had wanted to see until this morning. She said, into the silence that followed Preston's second use of the word ambush. Mr. Daly slid Mr. Corrigan's folder across the table before Mr. Corrigan had finished his second sentence. Nobody had asked her for it. Preston turned to her. He told her that she should think carefully about her situation in the room and about whose signature appeared on her performance reviews. Arlen Moss said, "Mine does." He said it without inflection. Then he asked Preston to step outside. Preston did not move at first. Then he gathered his laptop and his slide deck and the pricing proposal that had offered 22 cents of goodwill for every dollar of margin it was prepared to surrender, and he walked to the door. Ji-won Yoon stood up and opened it for him, because Ji-won Yoon was the kind of person who holds the door for someone who has just dismissed her. Not out of submission, but because she had decided long ago that her behavior would not be governed by the quality of theirs. Preston Daly stood on the wrong side of a boardroom door on the senior floor of a company he had run operationally for 8 years and understood, for the first time, that the floor itself was no longer his. The board questioned Miles Corrigan for another 90 minutes. Lorraine Beckett was the sharper interviewer. She had been quiet most of the morning and had a great deal she had been waiting to ask. She told Miles she was not inclined to hand an 1,800-person company to someone who was good at reading log files. She asked him one question that he answered more slowly than the others. She asked whether he wanted Preston Daly fired over what had happened in the glass-walled meeting room that morning. Miles said no. He said it clearly, without qualification. He said that no one should lose a career over the worst 4 seconds of their professional life, and that any organization that fires people for their worst moments will eventually be led entirely by people who are simply very careful about who is watching. He said the more important question was not what Preston had done that morning, but what the organization had built around him across 8 years that had made that behavior feel normal and unremarkable. Lorraine asked what a leader should actually be judged on then. Miles said he had 4 measures, and he counted them on the same legal pad. How they manage people, not by engagement surveys, but by whether talented people stay and continue to grow. How they respond to unfavorable data, measured by whether bad news travels upward at the same speed as good news, or whether it stalls somewhere in the middle. How they handle a customer who is telling them an uncomfortable truth, and how they treat a person they believe has no power over them. He said the 4th one was the only measure that could not be coached, rehearsed, or faked across a full-day assessment. He looked at the window and the rain still coming in off the coast, making the mountains invisible. He said, Ji-won Yoon has been tracking operational failures in this building for over a year. She documented it on her own time. No one asked her, no one told her to. She handed it to the first person she felt she could trust with it. He looked at Arlen. I would want to know what else she knows that nobody has bothered to ask about. Arlen Moss, who had built this company from a rented loft with 2 engineers and a second-hand server rack, wrote something on his notepad for the first time since the meeting had begun. Then he asked Miles whether he would accept the position if the board offered it. Miles said he had 3 conditions. The first, operational data, including unfavorable data, including data about his own performance, delivered to the board's audit function on a fixed schedule, unedited, whether he wanted it seen or not. If he was wrong about something, the board would know before he had finished being wrong about it. The second, a full assessment of the engineering management layer within 90 days, built around retention as a measured outcome rather than a secondary concern. The company had been promoting people who hit output targets by burning the people who produced them, and that would stop. The third, the authority to build his direct team through his own judgment rather than inherit a structure that had been selected for its willingness to agree. Arlen told him plainly that he was not the only candidate under consideration and that the board would vote before the end of the week. Then he said one other thing. He said it standing up, which for Arlen Moss was nearly a ceremony. He said, "You walked in here this morning without a title and without a position. You are not walking out without the board's confidence." The formal decision that followed was not theatrical. It was documented and procedural and heavy in the way that real institutional consequences always are. Arlen read the grounds of the succession review aloud. 18 months of margin decline against 9% revenue growth, senior engineering attrition at 4 times the historical baseline. A client confidence measure that had dropped sharply over the same period. An internal escalation system that had functionally stopped working. The near-permanent loss of the largest account in the portfolio to a cause the current leadership had categorized incorrectly in writing. The vote was taken. It was unanimous. When Preston Daly was brought back into the room, he said that the board had chosen Miles weeks ago, and that everything since had been performance for a decision already made. Arlen said no. He said that when Miles Corrigan had walked into the building that morning with the rain still on his coat, the board had not decided anything. 2 members had actively favored a different candidate as recently as the previous Friday. The file on the table had contained 4 names and no recommendation. Then Arlen looked down the corridor at the glass-walled room where it had all begun, visible through the boardroom window. He said, "You conducted your own evaluation before we conducted ours. You told us more about this candidate in 11 minutes than we learned from 4 weeks of structured assessment." Preston said he did not understand. Arlen explained it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. He said, "No assessment process we could design would have shown us what you showed us for free in that room. You showed us how this man behaves when someone with institutional power over him has decided he's nobody. He didn't invoke my name when 1 sentence would have ended the entire thing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't walk out. He didn't retaliate against a junior analyst who was only following the direction she'd been given. And when the situation reversed completely, and the advantage was entirely on his side, he handed it back. Because the client relationship was worth more to him than the pleasure of the moment." Arlen looked at the briefcase sitting on the floor beside Miles's chair, with the faint scuff along the leather flap where it had been slid across a laminate table. "We spent $40,000 on an outside assessment firm," he said. "You built a better test in a glass room on the 14th floor. You didn't charge us for it, and you didn't know you were running it." What crossed Preston Daly's face in that moment, that is the part worth sitting with, not the anger. The specific, vertiginous quality of understanding that the ground he had been defending was never where he had believed it was. The announcement went out company-wide the following Monday, 4 sentences long. Miles Corrigan became Chief Operating Officer of Axiom Logistics Systems on the 1st of December. He did not move into the corner office immediately because the furniture had not yet been transitioned, and he saw no reason to hurry anyone's boxes. He spent his first morning in a windowless room on the 12th floor, with 9 engineers who had not been directly asked their opinion in 2 years. He asked each of them the same 2 questions. What do you know that isn't making it upstairs? And what would you fix this week if I gave you the authority? His old briefcase sat beside his desk unreplaced. On the flap there was a faint mark, a scuff along the leather where it had slid across a laminate table on a Tuesday morning in November while the rain came in off the coast. Ji-won Yoon, who was now part of his direct team, had once offered to have it repaired. He had said no. Not because he wanted to remember Preston daily. He had thought about that, honestly, across the months that followed, and found that he did not think about Preston Daly very much at all. He kept it because of what the mark had cost him to prove. Power does not reveal who a person is through how they treat the people above them. Everyone performs well for an audience that can end them. It reveals them in the moment when they are absolutely certain, not mostly certain, but completely certain, that the person sitting in front of them cannot do anything about it. Preston Daly had been handed that test at 8:52 on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a glass-walled room with a half-erased whiteboard, with no board watching and nothing he believed was at stake. He had failed it before anyone told him he was taking it. And by 9 o'clock, the answer had already been recorded in the quiet of a man who sat still in a damp coat, with his hands folded over a briefcase that had been slid away from him like something no one wanted, and said nothing he would ever need to take back.